Hello, and welcome to today's live reading of Deadly Intentions by Anise Storm, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bit. Prologue. New York City, New York. The acrid scent of burnt rubber filled my nostrils as I rushed to the scene. On the cold, hard street lay the body of a woman, and it wasn't just any. It was Donatello Rossi, my best friend. A fear unlike any other filled me, but I couldn't concern myself with any of that now. I crouched down and immediately grabbed her hand, which was when I realized how still she was. My shaky fingers fumbled around her wrist as I tried my hardest to detect a pulse, but was wholly unsuccessful with that. Donna, I whispered softly at first, then a bit more forceful. Donna! The tears that had already sprung to my eyes began to spill forth, even though I tried to squeeze my lids shut for a few seconds, hoping to ward them off. It didn't help, and when a tear or two slid down my cheek, I swiped them away. I couldn't stay like this. I needed to get Donna to the hospital as fast as I could and pray that they could save her. Opening my eyes, I shook her body, and when I did, something warm and wet coated one of my sandaled feet. I looked down, and even though it was turning dark outside, I could still surmise that what was covering the tip of them. It was blood. And in that moment, I feared that I had been too late after all. My earlier terror grew exponentially, and I rolled my lifeless friend over onto her side. It was then that I saw the large gaping wound on her back, especially on the area bared by the nearly backless dress she was wearing. Are you sure you don't want to go, Viv? This party is going to be so much fun, Donna had told me earlier this evening before she left for the club. I wish now that I would have gone with her instead of feigning a headache so I could stay in our hotel room. A million daggers of regret pierced me, knowing that not only was my best friend dead, but she had died seemingly alone in a country that we were only visiting. So many questions ran through my head, and I had no answers for a single one of them. I immediately removed my hand, which was now as sticky as my foot, and scrambled onto my feet. Donna had mentioned the club earlier, but as I tried to rack my brain, I couldn't for the life of me remember ever hearing a name come from her. I was terrible at thinking under pressure. So no matter how hard I tried to remember anything that might help explain what happened, my mind was drawing blanks. It'll be so much fun, Viviana. We're only here for 2 more nights. Surely you don't want to waste the rest of this holiday cooped up in this place, she'd told me, even waving her hand to emphasize the suite we had been in for the last 10 days. Donna's father had spared no expense when it came to his daughter and her spontaneous jaunt across the ocean. We'd not come alone, but Donna's cousin basically ditched us at the airport, and he'd barely been seen or heard from since. I doubted that Raphael met the same fate that my friend just had, but I couldn't say it with any type of certainty. I wasn't concerned at all with that pompous prick, though. Rumor around Napoli was that he was involved with the mob, not that I kept up with any of that mafia stuff. I was a bookworm, and the most adventure I saw came between the pages of the fictional works that I read. You're always so boring, she'd told me, half teasing and half insulting me at the same time. I'm glad the Vaccaros know how to throw a party because this sitting around the hotel is not for me. Hey, I'm not sitting around the hotel all night. I've been telling you for days that I wanted to do the bus tour of the city at night. I'd only wanted to do that for the last week, but every time that I mentioned it to Donna, she'd wrinkle up her nose in disgust. They're double-decker ones, like we rode in London. The two of us had been best friends since birth, even having shared a nursery together for their first few days of life. We often vacationed together, and a few months earlier, we had both gone to England to see the sights. Granted, Donna was not as impressed with some of them as I had been, but she'd humored me out of something that didn't extend to the United States. In fact, since arriving in New York City, she'd been fantasizing about the type of men that her cousin was infamously rumored to hang with. In Italy, the mafia was well known. The southern port city of Napoli handled its fair share of imports, and none as secretive or evidently lucrative as what those men did. I was born yesterday, even though I often kept my head in the clouds. One day I would be a doctor, while Donna wanted to become Italy's next top supermodel. I looked down at her face, which was pale as snow. Her bright auburn hair was damp from her blood and tousled not from what should have been a pleasurable night, but from what looked like a struggle. There were cuts on her arms and throat, mostly defensive looking in nature. She'd put up a fight against whoever did this, and wanting to preserve evidence, I snatched my hand away from hers in case any DNA was available. A part of me wanted to continue to plead with her to come back to me, but I knew what a dead body looked and felt like, and this was it. Oh, Donna, I cried out, choking back a sob. Those same questions about who, what, why, and where came rushing back and weren't so easily pushed back anymore. Don Vaccaro is, she'd told me before I had cut her off. I don't care if the Pope himself is going to be there. I'm going on the city bus tour tonight, and you can either join me or make sure you put a card on the door if you're busy by the time that I return. That warning had to be placed because Donna was so beautiful and sensual that she attracted attention no matter where she went. I was more of a wallflower, and an introverted one at that, so I didn't garner the same reaction from those of the opposite sex. I was practically invisible, and knowing as much, I was suddenly cursing the fact that I hadn't gone along with her after all. I could have blended into the background as I so often did, and even if I couldn't have stopped the actions that had taken place tonight, I could have at least known who to finger as the culprits. Snitches get stitches, Donna had once told me, unless you're talking about the mafia. With them, you'll end up dead in ditches. Why did you have to be right about that? I murmured. I continued to stare at the woman I loved like a sister, and knowing that we would never share a laugh or a good cry again, had another sob escaping. Someone would pay for this if it was the last thing I did. I didn't make any promises, but this was one I now swore that I would. I took a few calming breaths as I tried to clear my head of my fear and grief, so I could focus more on the last conversation that we'd had together. The Vaccaros. The name came up more than once, and I knew they were involved. Their names were synonymous with crime in Italy, the family part of the Camorra organization. I remembered reading about them in the headlines more than once. I'd even attended a school superior, or what I learned was called high school here in America, with one of them. I tried to put a name to a face that now seemed to haunt my vision. He was much taller than me and had dark hair as well, even though it was a tad lighter than mine. Something else that seemed to strike me as odd now was that he had different color eyes. I'd learned a little about heterochromia from my studies, and I knew it was rare. Donna had a slight crush on the kid at one time, but she seemed to outgrow that. Now she tended to go after older men. She referred to them as sugar daddies, and I just thought it was gross. Who wanted to have sex with someone as old as their father? Certainly not me. I didn't know if it was a combination of that visual or the fact that I was hanging out with a corpse in the darkened alley, but suddenly I had a violent need to throw up. I turned and covered my mouth with my hand. I heaved once or twice, but nothing came out, so I turned back to Donna. I needed to be able to provide something to the authorities, and dropping the Vaccaro name of all the ones wouldn't be the wisest decision I could make, especially if they had nothing to do with it. It would be signing my death warrant, and as much as I would miss my best friend, I was in no hurry to join her in the afterlife. I needed to think. I closed my eyes as I retraced my steps from earlier. I had immediately taken the subway back to the hotel after the bus tour had ended. The station was a little over 3 blocks away, and I had nearly made it here when I saw a vehicle. I tried my best to focus on the Italian sports car speeding off into the night. If I could make out a make or model, then maybe it could help me identify her killer. All I could remember, however, was that it was silver. There were 3 people inside, and one had pushed the body onto the concrete moments before it sped away. I went to kneel back down, and that was when something warm but hard wrapped around my wrist. After I was jerked to my feet, I turned in time to see the kid I had thought about earlier staring directly into my eyes. Mine widened in terror while something else flashed in the one brown and the other green one of his. Nazario Vaccaro. I managed to keep any signs of remembrance to myself, and when I was about to speak, he covered my mouth with his free hand. You didn't see anything, Viviana Spataro, he whispered, and I knew why he spoke my full name. He was confirming that he not only knew who I was, but that I would be sorry if I said anything. His warning sent a shudder through me, and I spoke as soon as he pulled his hand away. I don't know what you mean. Don't fucking play with me. I know you and your elders. You're going to go into the hotel and did you do this? I had to ask, abandoning my common sense on the ground with my slain friend. No, he answered empathetically. It doesn't matter who did either. You're going to go to your room and forget seeing me or her. In the morning, you will call the authorities and report her missing. You'll then board the next plane back to Napoli and never speak of this night again." "I will do no such thing," I retorted as I tried to free myself from his grasp. I had to have a death wish after all because I was speaking to the son of one of Italy's most feared and dangerous families and defying him openly. "You will, or else," he warned menacingly. His words were as cold as the glare in his unique eyes. I squared my shoulders and tried my best to give him a look of my own. "Or else what?" "You'll be killed in a much worse way than your friend. In fact, no one will ever find the pieces of you by the time they're done with you." I gasped, and my body started to tremble violently. The very type of people that she idolized were the ones responsible for her demise, and might end up being the same for me. "You're going to do what I tell you and live, or—" He stopped to look down at his watch. He then turned to look over his shoulder. "They're coming. You need to get out of here and heed my warning before it's too late." Nazario, 10 years later, Naples, Italy. I rubbed my hands over my throbbing temple. I had been staring at numbers for more than 2 hours, and I was honestly about to blow a fucking blood vessel if I stayed in this room any longer. The techno beat of the music outside of the door raised and lowered depending on the song, and it made me wish I was out there even more. I had work to handle, however, so until it was done, I was stuck inside of my father's office. Stefano Vaccaro owned a number of businesses, including a nightclub here in Napoli, known for two things: sex and drugs. Oftentimes, the guests came for both. I could use a half hour with one of the women that flocked to this place. Prostitution wasn't frowned upon in these parts like it was in other corners of the world, and the whores kept on the premises had one job, and that was to see to the needs of the family, no matter how depraved they might be. I knew most by name because they were kept alive as long as they did what was asked of them. As soon as one betrayed the family, as my father often put it, they would be sold off and trafficked out of the country. Going back to the migraine I was nursing, I tried to close my eyes, hoping it would alleviate any of the pounding in my skull. That was for naught, so I returned my attention to the bank accounts dancing in my line of vision. Leonardo di Salva was the one responsible for making sure I laundered funds ended up in those banks in other parts of the world. My father trusted the man, but I did not. Mistakes had been made lately, and although they were so minuscule that even Stefan hadn't gotten wind of them, I couldn't allow them to continue. It was the reason I was now going through every last digit myself and paying for that initiative tenfold. "Maybe I just need a distraction," I said aloud. A half hour with one of those call girls was what I needed. I tended to want to fuck other women that could do something for me, but having lost my virginity almost 2 decades ago to a longtime squealo, I still didn't mind letting one suck me off when the mood struck. A hard cock was a normal state for me, and deciding that maybe stuffing one in their mouths with mine would drown out the noise in my head, I picked up the phone. I only needed to send a few words and a text message. I stood up after hitting send and undid the button. After hitting send and undid the button to my jeans. I lowered my zipper and pulled my dick out just as a knock sounded at the door. I knew who it was, and she came quickly. "Enter." As expected, Ruth entered on command and locked the door behind her. I didn't mind public spectacles, even harboring a bit of an exhibitionist side to me, but since I wasn't out on the main floor, but rather in my father's office, I opted for privacy. As she moved closer, I hit the save button on my laptop, then moved the screen out of her line of sight. She stopped in front of me, and no words needed to be exchanged as I pushed down on the top of her head. She dropped to her knees, and seconds later, her small hands and hot mouth were working in perfect tandem. I stood there with my legs somewhat spread, and I dropped my head back when her teeth grazed a sensitive spot. She was so damn efficient, her ministrations aimed at my pleasure alone. She didn't even give a single indication of any discomfort at being on her knees on the concrete floor, and I wouldn't have given a fuck if she had anyway. I weaved my hands through her long hair and tangled my fingers up in it, allowing me to immobilize her, and once I did, I began to thrust in her mouth. Caso, this had been a good idea from the moment because the rush of blood from my skull to my cock had all of the earlier thoughts fading away. Ruth had quite a mouth on her, and it was one that I had made use of often over the last several years. She'd come to Italy from Brooklyn a half-decade ago, and it'd probably been that long since I'd been to New York City myself. Back when I was 20, a woman had been killed and it nearly destroyed my entire family. What my father hadn't realized when he'd gutted the girl was that she was the daughter of someone so powerful and influential back home in Napoli that her murder had done more harm than good. My own family was also as strong, but ours wasn't on the right side of the law as hers had been. New rules were enacted practically overnight, even though I had retrieved the corpse and made sure to make it look like some random homicide on the New York City streets. It hadn't mattered to Giorgio Rossi. He didn't intended to make any and everyone pay for the loss of his only daughter. The mayor was on a warpath, and a decade later, not much had changed. If he had his way, though, women like Ruth and what she did would also become illegal, threatening something I never took lightly.